Piers, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to help clear up some of these, try and sift some of the myths from the facts, I suppose is probably a good
Yeah.
way of putting it. In this whole climate debate, or I shouldn't actually call it a debate, unfortunately a debate is exactly what we lack, the whole sort of climate story. Your weather channel website, weatheraction.com, you mention a few of the basic facts. I've got a couple of my own, and maybe we could sort of run through them in some sort of order,
Yeah.
and you could give us your perspective on them. One of the ones that really strikes me up front is the fact that according to all of the graphs I've seen that correlate CO2 with temperature, it appears that historically it's been much warmer than it is today in terms of average global temperatures. I mean, first of all, would you agree that that is undeniably true on the
Yes,
record?
that is undeniably true. We're in one of the colder periods we're in a colder period of an interglacial.
Yeah.
In the last 10,000 years, there have been 9. Well, you have about every 100 years or so a rather warm spell, or every 1,000 years, and various other ones. And in the last 10,000 years, there's been 9 other peaks, all of which have been warmer than the current peak, which
Right.
we're in now. Well, in fact, we're in the declining part of a peak.
And is this information gleaned from ice core samples, and therefore widely agreed as accurate and not disputed?
Yes, absolutely. No, it's not disputed at all, that data.
Okay, so that immediately to me sort of undermines or pulls the rug out from underneath any argument that would flag any concern that it's getting as warm as it has been in the past. Is it also?
No, it's not.
Is it also true that there have been far higher levels of atmospheric concentrations of CO2 than we have today?
Yes, in geological time, we've had 10 or 20 times more CO2 than now. And there was no runaway warming then.
Right.
No end height or anything, or all this, nothing of the hysterical nonsense that they're talking about now.
No, is it correct that sort of at the end of the dinosaur period, roughly speaking, in the order of 100 million years ago to 60 million years ago or so, is it true that there were much higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere at that stage?
There were, yeah.
Yeah.
At that time, in the time of the dinosaurs, there was much more CO2, and the atmosphere as a whole was thicker and denser and deeper.
Yeah.
So pterodactyls could fly, for example, because there was a deeper, more dense atmosphere. And pterodactyls couldn't fly in the current atmosphere.
Right. And would the increased levels of atmospheric CO2, which is plant food, would that have enabled the super dense levels of vegetation and able to actually support dinosaur life?
That's right. Those times were only possible because of a very large amount of CO2 and huge amounts of vegetation.
This does cast rather a shadow over the official story, doesn't it? So one of the things that people forget, of course, is that CO2 is plant food. Now, I heard from Dr. Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, that if atmospheric levels of CO2 were to drop beneath about 150 parts per million, plants would die. And I understand that currently they're hovering around That's correct, is it? And they're currently hovering at around about 400 parts per million?
Yeah, 400 parts per million, which is one of the lowest levels for the last 300 million years.
Gosh. So it's fair to say that we're in a sort of a dearth of CO2 at the moment. There's hardly.
We are. On geological timescales, we're in a dearth of CO2, yes.
Is there not considerable evidence that suggests that the planet is greening as well? I mean, I've heard that there's NASA.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And the increase of CO2 from about, it's difficult to know how accurate the measurements are, but perhaps, 20 years ago it was 0.035%, now it's 0.04%. But I wouldn't be certain of those actual figures, except it is agreed that there is more CO2 around now than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And that has led to more greening. And NOAA have shown figures taken by satellites which point that out.
Okay.
So the plants are growing more because there's more CO2. In fact, farmers, of course, if you're growing tomatoes, a standard way of increasing the crop is to put them in a greenhouse and double the amount of CO2. And that increases the growth rate by about 40%.
About 40%. Gosh, yes. So I've heard that vegetable growers in general pump CO2 into their greenhouses.
Do, yeah.
What's the optimal level? Do you know for plants? I've heard that it's something more approaching 1,000 parts per million. Is that true?
Well, yes. Well, of course, plants modify anyway, and if you put a large increase of CO2, they actually decrease the number of stomatal pores they have slightly. Well, doubling or trebling is very good. I would think that 10 times wouldn't be a problem either. Most of the greenhouses operate at 2 or 3 times the current levels.
Right.
And they probably found that most satisfactory.
Okay, maybe we could have a look at on your website. You cite one of the most important facts that I remember Al Gore walking along his huge hockey stick graph in his disingenuous film An Inconvenient Truth, and he says that the relationship between CO2 and temperature is complicated, and he leads us to believe, of course, that temperatures go up as a result of CO2 going up. Now, I understand that's actually completely backwards.
Oh,
can you explain that one?
Yes. What he showed was that if you run the CO2 and temperature data close enough together so you can't see the gaps, the time lapses, then they sort of move together. But if you look at it on scales of, a few hundred years, then you can see that carbon dioxide levels follow temperatures and they lag by about 500 or 800 years.
Okay.
And that is because of what happens in the slow processes in the sea. In the warm periods, CO2 is emitted by the upper levels of the ocean, like warming a bottle of pop, and CO2 comes off. And then the cold water being subducted by, e.g., melting near Greenland, for example, that cold water that goes deep into the ocean then absorbs that extra CO2. And that deep, high CO2 content water goes under the ocean and resurfaces typically 500 or 800 years later in the somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. So puts the CO2 back into the atmosphere. So that makes the lag of 500 years. So what we see now is a delayed effect of the medieval warm period. So
the whole thing is pretty much back to front, and it is temperatures that drive CO2 as opposed to CO2 driving temperatures.
That's right. CO2 levels are an effect, not a cause of changes in climate.
And you mentioned on your website, of course, the basic physics involved with the oceans absorbing CO2 and releasing it as they warm and cool over this long time scale, as you mentioned there.
That's right. We got graphs and showing the ocean currents as well. If you go on to the presentations, which is PowerPoint versions of them, near the start of our website, weatheraction.com. Go to the right-hand side and you'll find these links.
So it seems that there is a significant number of facts that fly completely in the face of the official scare narrative that we're in for climatic doom. So they're all citing the fact that we must reduce our CO2 emissions. We must obviously stop using energy and all that. What would you say is actually the real driver of climate?
Well, follow the money. What we have is a vast, worldwide, internationally organised propaganda exercise run by the governments and the deep state, and working for the interests of the super rich and the oil companies. They portray the oil companies as the enemy, but the oil companies are completely in cahoots with the scheme, because the consequence of the scheme is that energy prices go up, which means the profits in oil are basically doubled. and the oil companies are losing out on a tiny percentage of world energy supply, which goes to sustainable so-called things. On a world scale, only 2% of energy production is in by what they call sustainable processes.
Yeah, very small amount. I've heard it's...
So they double profits on 98% of world product in order to give and given away, if you like, 2%. So it's a complete no-brainer. I mean, the oil companies are right in there. The Citizens Online organisation, which from which Extinction Rebellion was launched, that includes on it all the 5G operators and former executives of ExxonMobil. So they're part and parcel of the propaganda campaign.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's as maybe. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we need energy, don't we? We need abundant, cheap energy, and it's pretty clear from what you say there, the 2% figure, if I heard you correctly, of renewables. That renewables, in spite of all the subsidy, in spite of all the hype and the excitement about them, renewables simply can't contribute in a really significant way to our global energy demands, and obviously
they're too expensive. They cost 3 times, 2 or 3 times, or 4 times, or 5 times, depending on what you do. Normal coal-based or oil-based energy production, and they also, a lot of them aren't actually green anyway in the claims they made. For example, the idea of everyone driving electric vehicles to save the planet is completely insane, because an electric car produces about twice as much CO2 per mile as does a diesel or a petrol car. In fact, these cars, electric cars, are coal-powered cars, because that is what most energy, electrical energy on a world scale, comes from, coal-fired power stations.
How is it such cars use 2 to 3 times as much? Is that due to the extra energy used in things like batteries and the technology, or is that just the efficiency loss in instead of taking the energy from a liquid hydrocarbon, storing it in a battery? Is that just energy losses, or is it manufacturing as well?
Well, it's both. You see, in a power station, you have to heat up steam and generate electricity. And the overall efficiency of that is about 50% tops. So you're losing half your energy there. Then in the process of charging and discharging the electric car, you're losing more. So, they produce, they're about twice as inefficient, if you like, as an oil or diesel. A diesel or petrol engine. You see, a diesel engine is a very efficient thing. It converts the fire which powers it is right inside the engine. So that's it, 2,000 degrees, right? Whereas a coal-fired power station, the peak temperature which it gets to is going to be 500 degrees. Black heat, I mean, absolute peak in the most modern, efficient coal-fired power stations. And the amount of energy you can get out depends on the upper temperature involved in the process. So the CO2, the system involving electrification is bound to be, and power stations is bound to be more inefficient.
So electric cars, absolutely, it might be a sort of virtue signalling gadget for people, but it's certainly not going to reduce CO2 emissions anyway. I'd also add they're extremely unhealthy because just the electromagnetic fields within the cars themselves. If anybody's concerned about EMFs, which they should be, wireless technology and so forth, an electric car, I understand it, is an absolute disaster to be driving around, spending any time in it. Perhaps we can turn then to the actual causes of what drives climate. Is it? I know that your research is looking into sunspots, and your weather forecasting is based on sunspot activity. Can you give us an overview then of your view of what is actually driving climate?
Yes, what drives climate change is changes in changes in solar activity, and how the solar wind, which is the rush of particles from the sun to the Earth and all the planets, how that connects with the Earth. And that is modulated by the moon and by various things in the state of the atmosphere, for example, stratospheric winds. Now, those themselves are also controlled by solar activity. So basically, we have a modulation process involving changes of solar activity and modulated by the moon. And we can look back in the past to use our equations to find out when there were similar Sun-Earth magnetic driving states to sometime in the future. And we use the weather in the past as a first step to modelling the weather in the future. And that's how we make our long-range forecast.
Okay, so you're essentially predicting the weather on sunspot activity. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And
yes.
What about the sort of the time lag associated? In terms of I understand that the sun is something like 9 minutes away from the Earth in terms of the speed of light. I'm not sure how fast these solar particles travel. What's the sort of time scale, and how does that work with predicting, say, the weather over a coming month?
We don't use much of the last month to predict the next month. We use much further in the past, hundreds of years or 100 years or so. The speed of particles coming from the sun in the solar wind is on average about 1 million miles an hour. So it takes about 4 days for those particles to reach Earth. So when you see a sunspot and it's emitting a coronal mass ejection, although some of that emissions will be very fast, and the fastest can get to Earth in about quarter of an hour. So the special waves, which can move at about half the speed of light, but most of the particles come at 1 million miles an hour, and that takes about 4 days.
So I remember that you appeared in a film, Channel 4 film, The Great Climate Swindle, some years ago now.
Great Global Warming Swindle,
beg your pardon. And which was a fascinating overview. I'd recommend that to any viewers. To I think that's on YouTube. I'll put a link to it below. In there, I think I remember seeing some graphs that fairly accurately show a correlation between historic sunspot activity and average global temperatures. Again, I understand that's probably measured from ice core samples. Is that fair to say that there is this close correlation?
Oh yes, it's undisputed close correlation between average smoothed out solar activity as measured by carbon-14 data, or inverted carbon-14 data, and world temperatures. And in fact, if we look at this wall here, you can see there's various graphs of this, but there's one here which I'm trying to get that. I don't know if can you see it now. If I move aside a bit,
I can see a little bit there.
I'm looking at the picture of it. It's you can see that the there's two curves. The lower one is a higher resolution one, and it shows the carbon-14 on the upper curve and the oxygen-18, which is an isotope measurement of temperature when the ice was formed. They move together reasonably well. It doesn't involve CO2 whatsoever.
So if I'm right then, or rather if I'm understanding you correctly here, Piers, that the general data that's out there, ice core samples, obviously the historic record of sunspots, there is an enormous amount of factual data that is not being disputed. It's in fact not even being talked about in the mainstream narrative. So that's being completely ignored, but we just hear this story of climate gloom and doom. Doesn't seem to make any sense.
Completely ignored. No, it doesn't make any sense. Unless there's a hidden agenda. It's a propaganda device. Yes, the interesting thing is, which is very amusing from my point of view, is that all this research work into ice cores and so on was done in order to try and prove the CO2 theoretical narrative. And I was present in the Royal Astronomical Society when the first data, which was, valid data, which was generally accepted, came from ice cores. And there was a little presentation going on, and I was talking to somebody, and I think Professor Martin Rees was present, actually. And somebody rushed up and said, "Oh, now there's data that shows that CO2 and temperatures move together." And somebody said, "Yes, there is, but it's the wrong way round." The little group of people went silent, So that was it. That was it exposed then. Now, that was 15 years ago, I think. Maybe, no, more than that, actually, 20 years ago. And more work has been done, but nowhere is there any data which shows CO2 levels drive temperature. The evidence is the other way round. But you see, all this data collected, and then these maps, world weather maps made of the past, which are estimates made from what the weather was, those become useful for my long-range weather forecasting.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we can come on to asking you a little bit more about your long-range weather forecasting. But maybe just before we go there, I can return to another point that you make on your website, weatheraction.com, that one of the awkward facts, if you like, that flies in the face of the official narrative is that I think is the human contribution to atmospheric carbon dioxide roughly 4%, and 96% other natural causes, rotting leaves, volcanoes, or whatever it is. So there's also a huge credibility gap there, isn't there, for any kind of conclusion that human activity, with its effect on that 4%, could actually achieve much of a result. Can you expand on that?
Well, of course, yes. Yeah, in order for the CO2 to drive climate, it requires evidence that it does. And there's no evidence that it does, it's the other way around. In order for CO2 to drive climate, it requires man to control the CO2 of the air. Now, how can man's 4% control the 96%? I mean, this is a conspiracy theory of nature gone mad. I mean, you see termites produce, anything between 2 and 10 times the CO2 effect of man. So are termites going to do man's bidding, right? Do termites in the jungle suddenly start producing more CO2 or methane when you drive your car around Reading University or whatever? I mean, it is completely bonkers. It is stark staring mad, this theory. But you see, they will not talk about it.
I must admit, I've never come across any kind of open debate seen anywhere in the mainstream narrative at all. So what about the issue of geoengineering? Because this is a matter of grave concern to me and a lot of other people I know, because it seems to be moving forward to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. And various, I've read a report by the Royal Society. I think it's quite an old report, published 2009, I believe, and it puts forward various different methods of addressing, this climate change narrative of imminent disaster due to man-made CO2, and it puts forward a number of suggestions. One of them being cloud seeding. Now, obviously, if you mention the phrase or the word chemtrails, you immediately get rubbished. But if you mention geoengineering, it's all okay. So perhaps we'll stick to geoengineering for the purpose of this conversation. So what do you understand are the moves afoot to, with this cloud seeding? What's all this about? Can you shed any light on that?
Well, that's not new. There's two aspects of geoengineering to talk about, really. One is cloud seeding to make rain where there otherwise wouldn't be rain or wouldn't be much rain. That's been going on for decades. In 1953, there was some cloud seeding experiments being done in Devon and Cornwall, and the consequence was the Lynmouth disaster floods, where a large cloud was seeded and made into a massive drop of torrential rain on Lynmouth. It wasn't what the military intended. They were just trying things out, and it worked too well. Now, you can make rain fall if you drop solid CO2 as a very cold thing, or silver iodide into clouds. and that will cause extra coalescence and rain. But you can't do it where there's no clouds, you see. So it's got a sort of limited use. You can't stop a drought with that. You can prevent clouds coming along to a certain area if you've got some Olympic Games going on or something. That is possible. But again, of course, if it's a very water-laden air, it'll still carry on. It will rain where you drop the stuff, but it will still carry on and rain wherever you don't want it to. So it's of limited effect. Now, the other thing going on is putting dust high up in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere. When very hot volcanoes erupt, they will take dust into the stratosphere, and that will hang around a long time, like years. And that can blot out sunlight and therefore cause cooling, because less energy from the sun actually reaches the earth due to, either more cloud reflecting or, in this case, dust. And Bill Gates has suddenly announced he wants Harvard University to work with him to do that, and they've agreed to do so, which to me, first thing is it's a message to don't go to Harvard University. And second thing is, I would say it's a desecration of the memory of John Harvard, who was a man from Southwark, where I live, and whose library, the John Harvard Library, we often use for our meetings in Southwark. Will they be able to do this? I don't know, because currently they're doing experiments with chalk dust, allegedly, over relatively tiny areas to see what happens. But I would say it's an abominable Dr. Strangelove, game. You see, if you've got any theory, any nonsense, any propaganda, any belief system, there's always going to be somebody coming forward to make money out of it. And what we have now is universities clamoring over themselves to grab money from Bill Gates to save the planet. But they're totally disingenuous people.
Yeah, and it seems wildly unethical to start executing any sort of plan allegedly solving a problem just on a whim, certainly based on a non-existent problem. We've already established that the facts of reality fly in the face of this trumped-up problem of imminent climate doom. So to be executing a plan of cloud seeding or of reflecting solar radiation and its effects on all of us seems massively unethical.
It's malevolent.
It seems horrific.
You see, what I would say, what will happen is if they do this, or equivalently, if we have a lot more volcanoes, if they could spark volcanoes, for example, that would do the same thing. That will hasten the onset of the little ice age we are now heading into. In fact, we're in the edges of this. Now, it could be that if they overdo what they're planning, if they get away with it, then that little ice age would never end, and we would move into a full ice age, because the interglacial period we're in, which is the periods between ice ages, which last 10,000 years, this interglacial is already 10,000 years long. So within 1,000 or 2,000 years, we're going to enter a full ice age anyway. And if they want to bring that forward, the Russians will come.
Okay, so you say we're entering a mini ice age. Some listeners might be surprised to hear that. I can't speak for other parts of the world, but here in the UK, we've had 1 or 2 nice warm weeks this summer, last summer, and of course the hysteria cranks up that this is disaster. I actually think it's quite pleasant. But does that not cast a shadow of doubt over what you're saying there? Can you offer us some of the proof that we're going to a mini ice age?
Well, during what we call a little ice age, the effect of the sun is to move the jet stream further south. So the area of warmth north of the jet stream in the northern hemisphere is bigger, and the area below is less, which is the warmer area. So it's the average temperature is lower. But when the jet stream is longer, and because of the effects from the sun, it gets a lot more wavy. So that can make some extreme warm periods, and on average, more and colder cold periods. But the mini ice age or little ice age periods are not uniformly super cold. The winters in them will be on average extremely cold, and we'll have very, very, very cold periods involving the sea freezing up and so on, which it did around the northern parts of Ireland in Britain during the last mini ice age.
And when was that, Piers? Was that around about the mid 1700s or so?
Well, yeah, there were two. There was the Maunder minimum, which is the 1600s to early 1700s, and then there was the Dalton minimum around the Napoleonic Wars, early 1800s. And we're certainly heading to something as cold as the Dalton minimum, and quite likely colder. But during, for example, the Maunder minimum, 1666, the Great Fire of London was in that. Now that the Great Fire of London was preceded by what was called the Belgian wind, and Belgium then was further south. So this was basically a southeast wind coming from what we know now described as northern France, and that went on for some weeks and was very hot and parching, and that dried out London and made it possible to have this fire. So that was an example of the warm aspect of the jet stream causing considerable heating. But the winters before and after that were generally extremely cold, with the Thames freezing over on a regular basis. So, a little ice age is not exclusively uniformly cold.
Gotcha. So it's quite, just to summarise that for the benefit of listeners, it's quite normal or understandable in a mini ice age to have the colder winters, but still have isolated warm periods within the summer as well.
Exactly, and these are predicted by us anyway. But of course, when they happen, the media only give you half the story. For example, last July 2018, was very warm, and the BBC was rampaging around about a world heat wave. Well, that was a lie, a complete, absolute, utter lie. The actual facts of temperatures on the 30th of July were that the land temperature in the northern hemisphere was 0.2 degrees centigrade below normal.
So we just had an isolated hot spot over the UK. Is that right?
We had a wild jet stream, which is making it hot in Western Europe, and extremely cold in Russia, and also cold in Japan.
So it sounds like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the weather in general. Misrepresentation, I beg your pardon, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got this whole crazy story driving energy reduction, driving extra taxes, and it's all actually built on no facts at all. It almost sounds surreal. It doesn't sound possible, does it? And this is something that I've noticed whenever I have conversations with people. They sort of scratch their head and they think, can it be possible that these facts that you and I have already outlined at the beginning of this discussion, those facts there withstanding, how can this story continue? How does it stand? How does the BBC carry on, and all the other voices of the mainstream media that champion this narrative? How does it carry on? It boggles me.
Of course, see, the BBC is run by people who know nothing about science. In fact, when I've had conversations with them, they just glaze over. They have a propaganda narrative in their minds and they repeat it. But you see, propaganda ruling mankind is not new at all.
True.
In the interwar years, and a number, at least two, dictatorships or highly centralized government operations were telling you what was true. And there were scientists busy in Russia putting forward certain views about how to make plants grow better, and in Germany about the causes of the problems, supposedly being Jewish people. Well, there were scientists around who were quite prepared to produce so-called evidence of these things, or theoretical ideas as to why these things were happening. And unfortunately, science is not actually an objective activity in general. I mean, the proper science is objective, of course, But you see, once you get into choosing data and choosing people to select data or select experiments, then, or only representing half the truth, then of course scientists become a semi-religious operation to justify a narrative. And that's what we have happening now. You see, Goebbels said at the time, he said, look, if you tell the population a big enough lie often enough, they will believe it. And the more crazy the lie, the more you'll get away with it, because people can't imagine that their rulers would tell them such preposterous lies.
Yeah.
But this is what we have now. It's a Goebbels-esque campaign. I mean, obviously, the motives of it are entirely different, but the Goebbels method of the big lie is with us.
Absolutely.
Now.
I must admit, I do have faith in science, as you kind of hinted at there. I think science is science. It can't be corrupted, but men can't they?
Correct.
When
got to be
evidence-based, exactly. I mean, human beings can tell whatever story they like, and we know that statistics can be used to tell any story you like. So what I think we have a manipulation of science when science is held up as showing us that this is true or that is true that isn't, then it clearly isn't the science. It's clearly a disingenuous human presentation of non-facts. So, Piers, maybe you could share just a little bit about your background. I maybe should have started this up at the front, but for those of you, those people that don't know you, I gather you have a degree in astrophysics.
Well, I started doing these things when I was a kid and made weather stations at school, and then got a Royal Scholarship to Imperial College and did physics and theoretical physics at Imperial College and got a first-class degree. And after that, I did research in various things, and then went to do astrophysics as a MSc in Queen Mary College. So that has been largely the basis on which I can do long-range weather forecasting.
Fascinating. So, and also, in closing, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your what you do with your long-range weather forecasts, and about your website and your mission and so forth.
Come along to weatheraction.com and you can download or view online various presentations or videos I've done of speeches made at Speaker's Corner, even on these matters. What we do at Weather Action is sell online long-range weather forecasts many months ahead, which are used by farmers, commodity traders, retailers, and so on to get a handle on what weather it's going to do to their businesses. And it's obviously very important for farmers because they need to know when harvesting can be done. Well, right now they're asking me, well, what will they be able to do for drilling? When's going to be the good times for drilling in the autumn? So if you've got snow-covered fields, that's going to be a problem.
So how far ahead can you see? What is the furthest prediction into the future? Is it a question of looking into the coming season, or can you see beyond that?
We can see beyond that, yes. We did some trial forecasts for the insurance companies in about 1998, where we looked 2 years ahead for big storms. And we successfully predicted the 5 biggest insurance loss periods in Britain for the insurance companies caused by major storms hitting these shores. And that was judged by independent peer review to be significantly skilled. Since then, we go into a lot more detail, but we can forecast that far ahead, yes. Mostly we produce things about 5 months, up to 5 months ahead. We put in extra detail, but there's nothing to stop us doing reasonably accurate longer range 2 years ahead.
And just one little question about that, the risk of repeating myself or repeating the issue, is that due to the sort of predictable pattern nature of the sunspot activity? You're looking back to look forward sort of thing, and you're relying on the predictability, and it clearly is predictable.
That's right, yes. Well, it is, but put another way, the different components of it have their own self-predicting life, if you like. So we're using the Earth as its own analog computer. So we just know when the whole patterns are coming together. They're not going to come together exactly, but you see what the moon is doing is a pattern. What the sun is doing is a pattern. What the stratospheric winds are doing is a pattern.
You mentioned earlier that the moon has an effect on the solar winds, on the particles reaching the Earth, and so forth.
Yes.
It is just due to its gravitational effect?
No, it's basically the moon blocking or getting in the way of the stream of particles.
Well, the moon and its sort of atmosphere in a mini form.
Well, the moon has an atmosphere. It does have a weak magnetic field, but it's pretty large anyway. Enough to block out the sun, so it does affect the solar wind, and you can see signals of this in the data, and we can find out when certain coincidences are repeating and use those to help understand how the weather changes. Now, of course, when we look in the past, you can't just take a weather map in the past, like this date 100 years ago or something, and use that. It's not like that. It's not going to be exactly the same date or anything, but there will be things in the past which you can then use to make what is going to happen in the present, and we can be 85% accurate on average on this way of
fantastic. I'm going to have to ask you before you go for your general prediction on the autumn weather in the UK. I mean, we're enjoying a warmer than usual period, or I've heard it said that we're going to. Is there any credibility in that?
Well, you see, the BBC will always tell you about something warmer. In fact, they shout it's going to be hot, hot, hot.
True.
But when it isn't hot, 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 they don't tell you it wasn't. When it's going to be cold, 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 no, they don't tell you. And then when it comes, they say, oh, it was a bit of cold weather here. So the language of presentation of forecasts itself is honest. What we're going to happen this autumn and early winter is going to be a very big shock for the warmers. There's going to be considerable amounts of snow and extreme cold blasts. If you want more, of course, you'll have to come onto the website and even buy. But definitely, we say there is going to be some extreme cold and heavy snow across Britain and Ireland this late autumn or mid and late autumn and early winter. And I did announce this at some events I went to over the weekend. I said this at a meeting in Oldham about climate change, and also I spoke at the Peterloo rally in Manchester, which is 200 years since the Peterloo massacre, you may or may not know about. And I did warn people then that things were coming which would make campaign work a bit difficult if there's too much snow around.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Well, one more question, if I may, Piers, given that you're an astrophysicist, is that one of the things that I've always been mystified with the moon particularly, and I've looked up this in numerous encyclopedias, that in order to try and explain why we only ever see one side of the moon, and it appears to me that these two spherical objects moving in space appear to the moon and the Earth appear to move together as though they were tied together by a pole or a string. It's as though they're locked. Is there any explanation for that? Because all of the encyclopedias I've ever read and the official sources say that the moon rotates around its own axis with exactly a 24 or 24 and a bit, whatever period of rotation, just sufficient so that it always looks the same way. But of course that wouldn't work. If it turned on its own axis at all, then we would see different parts of it. So how does that work?
No, it's not. No, it's always facing the Earth, and the Earth spins around underneath it. The reason why it always faces the Earth is because it's in an irregular object, and the moon's tidal force makes tides on the Earth, which mean that the tidal forces will pull the moon more one way on one side of the Earth than the other side. and because the moon's an irregular object, it will become phase locked. It's a standard thing you can read about in physics text. And a lot of moons in the solar system are phase locked into their mother planets.
Okay, so just in case I've got you right or wrong there, the moon, it doesn't have a regular distribution of mass across itself, so it might have a more dense part one side than the other, and therefore that's okay.
Yeah, or a bit sticking out.
Because it clearly looks spherical as we look at it. Obviously, we don't know what's the other side, but excellent, great stuff. Well, Piers, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate your time. Obviously, is there anything you'd like to say in closing, or anything?
Yes, I would say that. Go on weatheraction.com and watch the news, but join us in our protests on the 20th of September. We're going to have counter protests against the Extinction Rebellion climate emergency propaganda, where we're going to go around wearing yellow T-shirts with emblazoned on them, "I love CO2."
Great.
Or hashtag CO2 is good for you. And I would urge you also to come on my Twitter account, which is @Piers_Corbyn, where we'll give regular news of these
Excellent.
things.
And where will that march be setting out from, Piers?
Well, there'll be numbers of events around the country. There'll be some in London, which may be the BBC that's been suggested, or there could be many other places. And some other people in other towns are also going to do events. And our aim is to get in front of the cameras and say that CO2 is good for you, contrary to what you've been told, and get back to the basic science and facts.
Well, wouldn't it be good if we could actually arrange some kind of debate, an old style actual debate where we dealt with facts?
Well, on that day, fantastic. Well, I think one thing we might do is have a meeting in the John Harvard Library to point out that the Harvard University is an anti-scientific body and shouldn't be attended by anybody.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, Piers, once again, thank you so much for clearing up some of these facts about CO2 and climate change, and we'll do our best to get the message out and inform people, because we really need truth in order to thrive. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you everybody for listening, and do tune in again to another episode of Living Outside the Matrix. Change you want to see.